Colonization of Palestine, Tairishkin Model, the Noscowal, the Palestine, so Graham, Aaron Tocta, John Brady, Cultusa Coalition Disport.
I move the motion, Cahirlook. Recently, we have witnessed another sustained, brutal and unforgiving assault on the Palestinian people by Israel, in which hundreds of civilians, including 65 children, were slaughtered. The deliberate destruction of homes, media offices, libraries, police stations, a university, the only COVID test centre in Gaza, all breaches of the Geneva Convention. In other words, a war crime. But this violence did not take place in a vacuum. It was a direct consequence of 54 years of Israeli occupation and colonisation of Palestinian lands. We've brought forward this motion with the support of Trócaire, Sedatka, Christian Aid, ICTU, and a broad section of the Oireachtas, who I thank for co-signing it, the Social Democrats, the Labour Party, and numerous independents. A fundamental tenet of modern international law is legal maxim, which translates a lawbreaker cannot benefit from their illegal act. Since 1967, the international community has been unequivocally clear that the Israeli annexation of East Jerusalem and the West Bank has broken international law and constitutes a clear crime. The Israeli program to populate Palestinian lands, otherwise known as the settler program, has been the engine that has driven annexation. It is what has turned an Israeli military occupation into a colonization of Palestinian lands. Yet, despite all the legal rulings, the international law, the 30 UN Security Council resolutions, the hundreds of resolutions that have emanated from the UN General Assembly, Israel has never been held to account for its actions. The reality is that in Palestine, the application of international law is determined by the variables of power equation. And I do not need to remind anyone of the disparity of power on this issue. It is this power asymmetry that allows Israel to pursue a policy of managing the conflict rather than seek a meaningful rapprochement with Palestinians, in order that the illegal policy of annexation be allowed to continue to the point where there no longer remains a cohesive, coherent entity that was once the Palestinian people. Remarkably, if we adopt this motion here today, we will be the first European country to attempt to frame a fresh discourse around the conflict through the acknowledgement that annexation is taking place. A discourse based on the application of international law, of natural justice, and a belief in the moral obligation of nation states to refrain from the implementation of a policy of apartheid and the program of colonization, which we term annexation. We will be the first European Parliament to formally acknowledge that illegal annexation is taking place in the occupied Palestinian territories. For years, the EU has equivocated on the line that is a line in the sand if that happens, that they can introduce all sorts of serious measures. The EU claims to have prevented annexation from happening last summer. This is not the reality on the ground, which is the fact that de facto annexation is happening. We have the potential to change the EU position. In January of this year, the Israeli government approved the construction of more than 2,500 settlement housing units across the West Bank, including 460 units in East Jerusalem. According to Peace Now, during 2020, Israel approved or advanced construction of more than 12,000 settlement housing units, the most in a single year since the organisation began its monitoring work in 2012. And in the 9-week period from the 18th of January to the 21st of March 2021, OCA reported at least 204 Palestinian casualties in the West Bank alone, resulting from clashes, protests, search and arrest operations and settler attacks. The respected humanitarian groups, Human Rights Watch, Al-Hag and Bethlehem, have all labelled the Israeli government as an apartheid regime. And the Israeli regime, which strives to promote and perpetrate Jewish supremacy in the entire area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea is an apartheid regime. Accordingly, land is used to develop and expand existing illegal settlements and build new ones, while Palestinians are dispossessed and corralled into small, crowded enclaves, effective Bandustans. I acknowledge that others have brought forward other amendments, but I believe that it is important that we act with one voice. And I agree with the measures outlined in the People Before Profit amendment. And I'll finish on this point, Cathaoirleach. But today is about generating unity around one specific issue, and that is annexation. And ultimately, the discourse needs to move on to what sanctions and measures need to be imposed as a consequence of the continuous breaching of international law. And I believe that it is important that we remain focused on what we can achieve here today by supporting this motion.
Dr. Mary Lou MacDonald.
Today, this Dáil, this Parliament speaks with one voice. Today, we condemn the illegal and ongoing annexation, the illegal seizure of Palestinian lands by the Israeli occupier. Today, we condemn the illegal displacement of Palestinian families and communities from their homes and from their land. Today, we stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people, and we assert their inalienable right to their homes, to their land, to their homeland, their right to self-determination, a right that can never be extinguished. Today, we condemn the Israeli occupation and their illegal settlements. We state loudly, we state clearly that Israel violates international law when it forces Palestinian children, Palestinian women, Palestinian men at gunpoint off their land, when they bulldoze their homes. Israel violates international law when it transfers its settlers to illegally occupy Palestinian homes and Palestinian land. Israel has no right, has no claim and has no title to the occupied Palestinian territories. Their land grab is illegal. Their settlements are illegal. Their behaviour is criminal. They are guilty of crimes against the Palestinian people. And these are the facts. And the facts are not in dispute. Israel is a serial violator of international law, a serial violator of the human and democratic rights of the Palestinian people. So today we call on Israel to cease and desist its criminal behaviour, to end all settlement activity, to return stolen land, to end their occupation and to conform with the law. Today marks the most explicit and the most united call from this Parliament against annexation and against the illegal Israeli occupation. Long and bitter experience, of course, tells us that our calls may well land on deaf ears. So we call also on the international community, on the European family of nations, and most particularly on our own government in Dublin now to act to call Israel to account. We challenge all of the global community to move beyond the pious politics of condemnation onto the politics of accountability and the rule of law. And we challenge you, all of you, to use every means necessary, every diplomatic channel, every political lever, every economic tool to end what is now generations of human rights abuses. The Palestinian people are not seeking anything exceptional. They're not looking for more favourable treatment. They demand only the vindication of their rights, rights that neither Israel nor anyone else can take from them or render null and void. So let's assert again that these rights must be acknowledged, protected and vindicated. Corla, I believe that the case of Palestine is the acid test for the international community. Decisions have to be made. Choices have to be made. Does the world stand with the beleaguered, occupied Palestinian people? Or does it offer alibis and excuses for the Israeli occupier, for the Israeli lawbreaker? Do we stand with the brutalised, traumatised refugees and people of Gaza, or with the Israeli military machine? Do we finally, and most importantly, insist on calling Israel to account? Are we prepared now to face the Israeli apartheid regime down? Are we prepared to draw lines in the sand? Are we prepared to stand for freedom? I know where the Irish people stand on all of these matters. The Irish people stand with Palestine for freedom and for the rule of law. The great question now is whether our government here in Dublin, whether the European family of nations and the entire international global community is prepared to act. The time is now. The time to act is now, and that is what the global community demands.
Thank you, Deputy MacDonald. Deputy Munster.
Thank you. We were all relieved to hear news on Friday morning of a ceasefire in Gaza. After 11 days of absolute bombardment and slaughter, more than 250 people were killed, the overwhelming majority of them Palestinian, including at least 65 Palestinian children. Gaza was subjected to targeted shelling of houses, vital infrastructure like roads, electricity and water networks. But there's nothing new in that. The Palestinian people are forced to live under an apartheid regime. Gaza is an open-air prison enforced by the Israeli occupier. The Palestinian people are subjected to blockades, checkpoints, lack of access to basic amenities like water and electricity, and every possible abuse of human rights imaginable. Israel continues to steal Palestinian land and Palestinian homes while displacing people on a daily basis. The people of Gaza have endured unimaginable suffering. Here in Ireland, we need to show leadership and take a stand. We have a seat at the UN Security Council. That brings with it our responsibility to stand against this humane and unjust regime. We can't just be there to make up the numbers. Weak statements with no teeth simply aren't good enough. A start would be to recognise the state of Palestine. A Sinn Féin motion was passed in December 2014, calling on the government to recognise the state of Palestine, and over 6 years later, no action has been taken. The Occupied Territories Bill has been dropped by this government, even though Fianna Fáil and the Green Party supported it before they were in power. We have to take a stand to support the Palestinian people and hold Israel to account. And as a Parliament, we have to take a united stand against Israel's apartheid regime and continued land seizures. Civic society and the Irish people are behind this. We have to unite and do the right thing for Palestine.
Thank you very much. Deputy Tully.
Minister, I think we're all united in our opinion that what was happening in Palestine and Gaza in particular had to stop. And of course we all welcome the ceasefire announced last week. But many ceasefires have there been over the 54 years of Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory. And how long will this ceasefire last until Israel starts stealing Palestinian land again and continuing to commit war crimes and force the Palestinian people to continue to live in absolutely dreadful conditions? A statement from government condemning Israel's abuse of Palestinians is not enough. Statements such as these have done nothing to stop continued abuse by the Israeli state against the Palestinian people. Israel has continually, over the last 54 years, committed war crimes with no fear of consequences because they've never had to face any. Israel is part of, or Ireland, sorry, is part of the EU, and we're part of the UN. And so why are these organisations not doing more to stop this cycle of violence, to stop the annexation and to put in place a workable peace process? There needs to be a permanent end to the violence for the people of Palestine, regardless of which part they live in. And they need to be able to live in peace without fear of indiscriminate bombing and shooting. The International Criminal Court must investigate the actions of Israel and investigate them for war crimes. All people in this region deserve to be able to live in peace without the fear of death or serious injury. So the violence must end, and it must end forever. But currently we've over 5 million Palestinian people living in an area without proper access to clean water or proper sewerage systems or energy supplies, and who daily fear that their homes will either be demolished by a bomb or a missile coming from Israel, or that they will be just evicted from their homes and their homes taken. People in Ireland sympathise and understand what the Palestinian people are experiencing, as the northern part of our country experienced similar for many years, where innocent people, like those in Ballymurphy, were shot down and without consequence. And it took almost 40 years for those people to be declared innocent. We had Bloody Sunday in Derry, and we shoot to kill policies. So we know and understand in this country what it's like. It needs to stop, it needs to end, and there needs to be a proper peace process put in place. And if action isn't taken now, we're going to continue to see the cycles of violence, ceasefires called, everything going quiet for a while, and then everything is resumed again. It's time that we in this Dáil stood together by passing an all-party motion condemning the actions of Israel and supporting the cause for a Palestinian state.
Thank you, Deputy Rory O'Murco. Deputy Brian Stanley.
He's asked me to swap with him. The state here has a responsibility to call out the illegal Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands and that system of apartheid that they've enforced for over 5 decades. The world has looked on in horror at the barbaric violation of basic human rights of Palestinians by Israel. The Israeli military onslaughts have driven Palestinians out of their homes in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and forced them into the open-air prison that's called Gaza, where missiles have recently rained down on top of innocent men, women and children, killing 64 children and hundreds of adults. Palestinians are trapped, denied water, sanitation, electricity, medical supplies and basic building material. They're rendered homeless and stateless by an army that has been complicit and has the complicit support of some of the international community, who should hang their heads in shame. The European Union could have done more, but it has shown itself to be a paper tiger. It has failed to take action. And compare this to the swift and correct swift action in relation to Belarus within 24 hours. Here in this state, the government has to recognise the state of Palestine. The Sinn Féin motion, which was passed by the Dáil unanimously over 3 years ago, that needs to be adopted by the government. And in the most recent sustained brutal onslaught on the Palestinian people, we've seen the slaughter taking place. And 9 primary healthcare centres have been bombed, 6 hospitals, a COVID lab, the Ministry of Health buildings, a university, a library and the offices of the media, all destroyed by bombs dropped from Israeli warplanes, which is in breach of the Geneva Convention. To conclude, we need a long-term solution. It's now required to bring justice and freedom for the Palestinian people. And as a state that we're only finding our way now out of the history of imperial oppression, Ireland has a responsibility. We have a seat at UN Security Council. We need to use that. I implored the Minister for Foreign Affairs and the Taoiseach and the government to use that so as to work towards and to force the EU as well to get a proper solution, a long-term solution, and to end the Israeli war crimes in Gaza and against the Palestinian people. Thank you.
Now.
The recent slaughter in Palestine is only continuity of what Palestinians have been dealing with. But beyond that, we need to recognise as a House in here that what has been going on since 1967 is a modern day colonization, plantation and land grab. We've had de facto annexation. So we need to accept that in here, and then we need to use that as a weapon to put pressure on an international basis, because there has been an abject failure by the international community across the board. I do welcome the action that has been taken in relation to Belarus, but this has to also be done on behalf of the Palestinians. I welcome that the Minister has said there is no return to business as normal. So we have to ensure that that is the case. And what we have here is we have a weapon that we can give to the Minister. What it is it's accepting the reality the Palestinians are dealing with of annexation. He needs to go to Europe with this, and we need to demand that there are sanctions and that there are consequences, because the Israelis have never had that. And on that basis, they've been able to deal with the Palestinians, slaughter them and steal land. We need to do to the Israeli state what was done to apartheid South Africa. It has to be made to be seen as a pariah. There have to be consequences for war crimes and international criminality.
Deputy Mairead Farrell sharing with Deputies Ryan, Ellis and Andrews.
Ara, perhaps there's no other Western country in the world which feels the same sense of solidarity with the Palestinian people quite like the people of Ireland. And as we watch in horror as bombs are dropped on Palestinian homes, on their hospitals, on their media outlets, we feel their pain, and critically we know as Irish people we have a duty to shout stop. As Irish people, we don't have the luxury to pretend we don't know, to pretend that we don't understand. We have a duty to stand in solidarity with the people of Palestine and call the Israeli actions out for what they are, and that is apartheid. We have seen the continued Israeli settlement expansion, the forced expulsions, and the refusal to grant the right of return to Palestinian refugees. Israel says it wants peace. It says it wants a viable two-state solution, but actions speak louder than words, and by God, are their actions loud. It continues to place its heavily fortified settlements on Palestinian land. It's divided up the West Bank into Bantustans with military checkpoints, and it consistently lays siege to Gaza. And it does all of this under the pretext of self-defense. Palestine is the tragedy of our time. Hanan Ashwari, the peace activist, has said that the absence from international sanctions has enabled the creation of a horror in Gaza. It is a living horror. And yet we hear prominent politicians across the world who engage in bad faith false equivalence. They use language around this conflict which is designed to obscure what's going on. They talk about Israel's right to security. Israel is a nuclear power with the fourth largest standing army in the world. What about Palestine's right to security? In Gaza, only 1 in 10 people have direct access to clean water. We have seen the horrific bombings. Does that look like a secure existence? And we hear talk in the media of clashes and ceasefires, which create the false impression that this is a conflict between equal forces. It is anything but. It is a struggle between a colonizer and the oppressed. It is a struggle for self-determination versus a harsh and brutal system of apartheid. This July will mark 37 years since Dunwood's workers here in Ireland stood against apartheid. Let Ireland once again stand up to an apartheid regime and pass this bill.
Deputy Ryan.
Minister, a philosopher once wrote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." George Santan is also known to have said, "Only the dead have seen the end of war." Two very appropriate sayings in relation to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I recently watched 2 films, Schindler's List and Born in Gaza. There are many similarities between the movies, but one that stood out for me was the use of gravestones as pavements in a concentration camp in Schindler's List, and very similar headstones in Born in Gaza, when children visited the grave of their father who had been killed while they were there to water his plants. Both films are horrific and tell the stories of the ethnic cleansing of people who are very inconveniently in the way. The international community community needs to do more if we are not to be condemned to repeat the history. Have we not learned lessons from Bosnia and Kosovo? We must address the root causes of the conflict in the occupation of Palestinian land, the displacement of the Palestinian people, the continued blockade and the occupied territories of the endless cycle of violence which is inevitable if we don't act now. Since 1967, Israeli authorities have uprooted over 800,000 olive trees from an area 5 times the size of the Curragh of Kildare. They have targeted farmers to discourage them and their families from remaining on their own land. Ireland was instrumental in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, and we must stand up for the Palestinian people. It is time to honour the commitment to recognise the Palestinian state. It is time to enact the Occupied Territories Bill to ban both imports from land that has been stolen from the ordinary Palestinian families. The world has shown it can work together to try to solve problems like COVID-19, climate change and in response to natural disasters. We must turn our efforts to a two-state solution for Palestine. Minister, Israel are breaking international law and there must be consequences for that.
Deputy Ellis.
The Gaza Strip is one of the most densely populated areas of the world, where over 2 million people are squeezed into an area smaller than County Louth, the smallest county in Ireland. The people of Gaza are discriminated against and humiliated by the Israeli on a daily basis. There has been a land, air and sea blockade of the Gaza Strip since the early 1990s, which has resulted in great hardship for its residents, and it has led to a serious deterioration in living conditions for the population. This being made worse in the midst of a global pandemic. At the end of April, less than 2% of Gaza's population had received at least 1 dose of vaccine, compared to over 60% of the Israeli population. Vaccinations were stopped and testing was impossible to carry out during the recent conflict. There is a real concern that the enclave could be hit by a third wave of COVID-19. Dozens of schools that became shelters during the conflict are now feared to have become super spreaders. The disproportionate response by Israel to carry out attacks on clearly identifiable civilian areas and complexes led to the deaths of at least 222 people, including 63 children. In a 10-day period, Israel destroyed more than 450 buildings in the Gaza Strip. Amongst the buildings destroyed were 6 hospitals, 9 healthcare centres and a water desalination plant, which supplies around 250,000 Palestinians with clean drinking water. Israeli forces also targeted a tower which housed various media outlets that included the Al Jazeera network and the Associated Press. 74,000 Palestinians, mostly women and children, are now homeless as a result of these targeted Israeli attacks on the civilian population. These attacks by Israel violate international human rights standards. They are nothing less than war crimes as defined under international law, and as such there is both individual and state responsibility for these war crimes. The state of Israel and those individuals responsible for the planning and carrying out of these actions should be held accountable for these war crimes.
Andrews.
Thanks, Ceann. The kidnapping, Minister, of a young journalist by Belarus was met with loud shouts by government and the EU of the need for swift action, sanctions, severe consequences. The Taoiseach said the kidnapping was a state-sponsored coercive act and would respond very strongly. These strong words and plans for actions and sanctions contrast starkly with the weak and watery position and language directed at Israel for the murder and terror inflicted on Palestine over 11 days, killing 248 Palestinians. Yesterday, EU leaders agreed a range of sanctions and actions against Belarus, almost overnight. However, all we heard from government during the slaughter and terror of Palestine was about building consensus and how now was not the right time to recognise the state of Palestine and we couldn't introduce sanctions. It's shocking but hardly surprising. You and I know, Minister, we all know that there will be no consensus reached because Israel and its sponsors do not want consensus. They want to wipe out Palestine and make a two-state solution impossible. Government talks about a two-state solution, yet only recognises one state, and that's the apartheid, racist, terrorist state that is Israel. President Joe Biden has said in the past that there is no space between the United States and Israel. Well, this government over the last week has shown there's no space between this government and Israel. There's no space between the EU and Israel. If we are going to stop the slaughter in Palestine, we need to recognise the state of Palestine. We need to implement Francis Black's Occupied Territories Bill. We need to boycott Israel. We need divestment from Israel. And we need sanctions against Israel. We need to make it clear to Israel that their land grabs and their annexation has not got Ireland's support. And when they do it, when they grab land from people, take other people's homes, there will be consequences, because until now there has been none. Thank you.
Deputy Pat Daly is going to speak together with Deputy Pat Buckley and Johnny Brady to conclude.
Over the past fortnight, 213 people, including 61 children, have been killed in Gaza. 1,400 Palestinians were injured, tens of thousands displaced from their homes, according to the United Nations. Rallies were held all over Ireland, including 2 in Kerry, 1 in Clarny and 1 in Tralee, my town, which is twinned with Beit Sahur in the West Bank. We sent, I believe, a strong message of solidarity to them. The other rally I was at in the last fortnight was up in Gortaglana, where 4 men were lined up in North Kerry and shot by the Black and Tans 100 years ago this week. 1 survived and was able to counter the narrative that there was a battle and the Black and Tans had shot the 3 men in self-defence. With this motion here, we are countering the narrative that the State of Israel are acting in self-defence, the narrative that there was clashes between Palestinians and Israel, that the attacks were were attacks on Hamas, or that it's acceptable to bomb a building and kill 20 children because someone from Hamas is suspected of being present. We also know in this country of gerrymandering, false majorities, about discrimination. Israel continues to refer to the Palestinians as a minority, even though they're in a majority between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. Israel maintains a veneer of democracy, even though many Palestinians are disenfranchised. The real story is that 750,000 Palestinians were removed from their homes in the 40s. They were moved to refugee camps, and those refugees were forced to flee their home, have no connection to this land, according to Israel. The truth is that Jerusalem was illegally annexed in 1967, and the annexations continue to this day. The UN resolution states that any actions to alter the status of Jerusalem are illegal. The story is that Israel continues to allow settlements to be constructed contrary to international law. We know about the Jewish nation-state law, enshrining Jewish superiority and further eroding the status of Palestinians, downgrading their language and promoting Jewish settlement. The truth is that attacks that kill 20 children is not self-defence under any recognised definition. The truth is that the international community, especially the USA and the UK, has let them away with it. I heard you saying, Minister, we will do all we can, but I don't believe that we are doing all we can. Israel is acting with impunity. Palestinians have little power. Bob Dylan was mentioned. I think we are standing in the doorway and we're blocking up the hall rather than doing anything proper about it. We must formally recognise the state of Palestine, implement the Occupied Territories Bill, demand a right to return. We're on the Security Council. We need to implement resolutions. We need to send a strong message now. And I'll quote Ian Brown from the Stone Roses. How many mothers have to cry? How many sons have to die? How many missions to fly over Palestine? Because as a matter of fact, it's a pact, it's an act. These are illegal attacks.
Thank you. Deputy Buckley. Yeah, he moved us when he spoke.
Thank you. The EU has given a very clear response to this. Otherwise, we're giving all the wrong signals. European leaders will, I hope, send a very strong signal to a regime that is repressing their own people, expelling foreign journalists, silencing civil society and human rights defenders. I think if there is indecision or weakness shown by the EU, it will reinforce in the minds of the decision makers in that country that we have done the right thing here. The response needs to be clear, tough, and needs to happen quickly. There needs to be an independent international inquiry into what happened. EU leaders must make clear This will not be tolerated. What is needed now is a specific response. The EU and its institutions have clear options in terms of sanctions, but they have to be sanctions that will be noticed and cause concern. The structure is there. There is something that needs to be very strong sanction response. It can't be strong words or press releases. There has to be a real edge. These are not my words. These are the words of Minister Simon Coveney in relation to Belarus this week. I don't think it's a point that needs to be overstated that the response to a country that has killed nearly 250 people, injured thousands in bombings of civilian areas in just a few weeks requires a much stronger response. But that has not come. In fact, the EU and its allies fund Israel, either directly or indirectly, to carry out the massacre of Palestinians. Palestine dispossession through home demolitions, land theft, and what brought us to the present moment, which began with an attempt to evict Palestinian families from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah on the basis of racist and discriminatory law. Only a reality in which Israelis and Palestinians alike enjoy equal rights and dignity will bring quieter times to this region. And that is the reality towards we must work together. Ceasefire is not enough. We also advance steps to address the core and underlying problem of occupation and inequality and ensure that Israel does not take unilateral action that would undermine chances of peace. There must be consequences for violations of international law. These are not my words. These are actually the words of a former President of Israel, Avram Burgat. I welcome the ceasefire, but with a de facto annexation, I have to call on the government to say that words are not enough. Stern actions needed now, and you have to support the Sinn Féin motion.
Thank you very much. Deputy Brady to conclude.
Thanks, Count Corla. Well, we've heard the arguments and we have heard the amendments as well. And I again call on members to remain focused on the magnitude on what we are on the cusp of actually achieving here. We will be become the first European country to formally acknowledge that the crime of annexation has taken place. The architecture of the Israeli government's strategy on the development of settlements signals the intention of making this a permanent fixture. And while the EU has talked about the need for Israel to avoid the red line of annexation, we have the potential to bring Europe over that line. We have the potential to move EU policy in relation to Palestine, and I welcome the comments of Minister Coveney in formally and explicitly stating that what is taking place is de facto annexation. Yes, the motion reflects the concern of the Irish people at the plight of the Palestinian people. The memory and the consequence of colonisation lives in the very marrow of our bones. It is right that with our unique understanding of the experience of colonisation, that we will be the first parliament in Europe to call out Israel on its apartheid policies. I feel the need to address some of what I regard as the unfortunate comments of the Minister. As I, along with a coalition of NGOs, reached out to the government in good faith on this motion, and we were quite careful to explicitly condemn attacks on civilian populations and civilian infrastructure. And I want to point out to the Minister that a civilian is a civilian. And I certainly do not distinguish one from another. And trying to imply otherwise does a disservice to what we are on the cusp of actually achieving here with this motion. And last week, we had statements on Palestine following the most recent Israeli onslaught against Palestinians. What was remarkable was the evidence of cross-party unity on the issue of Palestine. And I was touched by the emotion contained in the contribution of some of the contributors. And I appeal to all members here today, of all political views, to direct that emotion, that feeling and that concern for the Palestinian people towards actually achieving a tangible, very real victory for the cause of justice and humanity. And with the potential to move the goalposts in relation to the issue, we can set and train a process that can rip the gates off the open-air prison that is the occupied Palestinian territories. And we share the frustration of the Minister when it comes to the UN Security Council needing 2 weeks to agree a response. And if we get this motion agreed, all who speak for this Dáil will now carry the imprimatur of the Irish people. But what next? On this, I want to turn to a letter from Michael Lynk, United Nations Special Rapporteur for the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, who felt compelled to write to Minister Coveney on the strength of this motion coming before the Dáil. And I quote, "Accordingly, I would call upon your government to adopt meaningful accountability measures respecting the Israeli occupation that would include halting all Irish economic activity and trade with the illegal Israeli settlements, reviewing and downgrading Ireland's military relationship with the Israeli military, and recognising that Israel has de facto annexed much of the West Bank, which is under illegal law, which is as illegal under international law as de jure annexation, and using its voice within the European Union for Brussels to support measures to review and downgrade its economic, cultural, military and diplomatic relations with Israel until the occupation fully ends." Those comments on the Special Rapporteur spell out what this Dáil needs to do. We need to pass the Occupied Territories Bill. Yes, we need to look at sanctions. We need to formally recognise the State of Palestine. And yes, the Israeli ambassador should go. And I'll conclude on this, Count Corlett. I contend that in passing this motion, we are mandating our government to move forward to the next stage, which is to work internationally to introduce measures that will hold Israel truly to account. And I commend this motion to the Dáil, and I hope it will be fully supported by all.
Thank you very much. That therefore concludes our consideration of the motion regarding the annexation of Palestine. Private members' business. We must first now consider amendment number 2 in the name of the Minister. Is amendment number... Yes, Minister?
I move.
Which has been moved by the Minister. Is the amendment agreed?
Yep.
Amendment agreed?
Yep.
Amendment agreed?
Agreed.
Not agreed? Well, you better speak up. Amendment not agreed. Chakti Athar Havna Tarishkana Arbadish Ta. Shivshatana Gaina Arbadish Neil. Stoilum Gwil on Keshtricha. I believe the question is carried. Question is carried. The amendment is made. All right. Okay, how stands amendment number 2 then? Or number 1 is in the name of Deputy Boyd Barrett. Is amendment number 1 being pressed?
It is.
It is, okay. The Chakti Athar Havna Tarish Guna Show, Abradish Ta.
Ta.
The Chakti Athar Guna, Abradish Neil.
Neil.
Stoilum Gwil Boo Chair in case to believe the question is defeated.
Vote all.
Vote all. Okay, so far as the vote has been called for, that vote is deferred until the weekly division tomorrow.